Welcome to Kontext TV. Our guest here at the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Berlin is Silvia Federici. She's a professor emerita at Hofstra University, Long Island, New York, and worldwide renowned as an activist for women's rights and a society beyond capitalism. Welcome to Kontext TV, Silvia Federici.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Since the financial crisis in 2008, capitalism has become more and more unpopular in Europe and also in the US. According to polls, 80% of the Germans would like to have a different economic system. Capitalism seems not only unable to solve the global ecological crisis or the growing gap between rich and poor, but to be the driving force behind these crises. However, an alternative system is not at hand, with state socialism being largely discredited. In this situation, you and other activists and scholars propose the concept of commons as a way to overcome ecological devastation and social injustice. Explain the concept of the commons or the common.
Yes, I think the idea of the commons, the principle of the commons, has come back since the 90s, actually, in our political discourse, our political practice, precisely in response to the incredible devastation that this new drive of this advance of capitalist relation across the world has produced, and particularly in the forms of our social reproduction. There are now millions of people across the world, for whom the possibility to reproduce themselves on a day-to-day basis is in question, because we have been witnesses massive land expropriation, precarization of income, jobs and income, cuts in social services. First of all, commons means that a politics of survival. It means that the ability and the need for many people to pull their resources together and to create, to construct, alternative forms of existence and reproduction, because we don't have access, less and less, to the market or less access to income. So this is a very important consideration, and we see that, for instance, one inspiration comes from Latin America, many communities in Latin America, where, for example, women have been in the forefront of creating these new forms of reproduction. For example, popular kitchen, urban gardens, and many of those forms of reproduction have also been imported by immigrants in our community in the United States. For example, the urban garden movement is a movement that has been inspired and by immigrants in particular. But commons are also something more than means to cater to our reproduction. They also are a way for us to, first of all, begin to reconstruct a social fabric which has been destroyed by years and years of industrial relocation, of high rents that have basically expelled many people out of our cities, and basically policies that have led to the termination of the forms of organization that workers have created over centuries of struggle. So commons are also a way to recreate not only mutual aid, but to recreate bonds of solidarity, where now we often have a vacuum. And that's why we speak of communities of resistance. And equally important, the principle of the commons, it's really a principle, is the principle of reclaiming control of our life, of basically beginning to reappropriate the decision-making that controls, decides about our everyday life, which now we do not have. And so, and creating from the beginning forms of existence that are organized according to a different logic than the logic of the market. Until 30, 40 years ago, people did not think of the idea of growing your own food, in a town was inconceivable. But now it's beginning to take roots. And now we know a city like Detroit, that used to be the capital of the world, the industrial capital of the world, now has large areas that are devoted to farming. And in the process, even if those experiments are still relatively small, I think that much has been gained in the process of engaging in them. Not only new forms of cooperation, but also a whole reflection and knowledge production about food. The realization that it's important that we know that when we have access to food, we do not poison ourselves. The realization that if we want to control our life, we should be able to control, first of all, the basic forms of our nourishment. And the garden have not only been places where food has been produced, they've been also places where knowledge has been produced. A lot of knowledge about growing, cultivating, preserving. Some of the urban gardens in New York, for instance, have connection with schools, where the children may go there and also being taught that, for example, food does not come in a plastic bag. The process of growing and learning to establish a contact with the land that normally they would not be able to have. Now, the challenge, of course, is scale. The challenge is how to connect the garden, but not only connect the garden. For example, to connect the garden with the other experiments that are being made, the Free University, the Knowledge Commons, to connect the garden with the struggle that are taking place for higher wages, for against cuts in education. So that, for example, the garden could connect and provide food to the people on strike. So I think that this is the terrain on which a lot of possibilities, are opening up. And I think this is the terrain that we need to explore, that we need to occupy.
It is often argued that commons cannot work because once people commonly use resources they do not own, they will necessarily overexploit them. If nobody owns things, nobody cares in the end, as Garrett Hardin famously argued in The Tragedy of the Commons. What would you reply?
Garrett Hardin has been so, it's been so contested and so disproven. Garrett Hardin really was speaking of commons as open access, realities. Open access meaning everything goes. Anybody can take. And first of all, we have to challenge this idea of this inner drive the human being have to self-interest, not caring for others. Actually, quite the opposite that probably led to them themselves and not, living in an exploitative system. Human beings are equally motivated by the desire for mutual aid and empathy, as Kropotkin, for example, has so often insisted. But in the case of Garrett Hardin, historically, commons have never been open access. Have always involved communities, have involved regulations, and they have decided, how much to use of the resources they provide. So that argument is really unfounded.
Karl Marx has famously described the process of what he called primitive accumulation as a precondition for capitalism, the violent expropriation of the commons by private interests. However, in your book Caliban and the Witch, you argue that primitive accumulation has not only taken place once in the past, but is since then going on all over the world.
Yes.
Explain what primitive accumulation is and why you think it is still going on. And
examples. Marx was absolutely right. I mean, primitive accumulation is the system, the started capitally is the event. They start a capitalist system because it deprives, now millions of people of the basic means of subsistence, and therefore makes them vulnerable, opens them up, to a process of exploitation. And now, because they have nothing to support themselves, they have to accept any form of labor, any forms of exploitation. Well, what we are witnessing, one of the arguments I make, and I'm not alone now, I think this is becoming a common view, is that globalization is a new phase. That actually all through the history of capitalist relation, capitalist society, capitalism has resorted to forms of primitive accumulation in those moments of crisis when it needed to regain the command over the labor force. And the primitive accumulation is the moment, is that strategy that basically attacks people's means of subsistence. For example, through land appropriation, of land grabbing. War, it's also a means of primitive accumulation, because war expels an entire population from certain territories and opens up those territories to exploitation. We see that today, every day we see that process. So I'm arguing that globalization has been fundamentally, in essence, has been a massive assault on people's means of reproduction.
Which role do women play in the common movements?
I've been in Mexico, and I have contact with women in other parts of Latin America, and you can see the women are in the forefront of many struggles against the construction of dams, against deforestation, against the contamination of rivers when companies want to build buildings, firms that are polluting, factories that are polluting on a river. The women are very much, and there's beautiful politics that are developing, and the women in Mexico who are struggling for the commons, and they use this language, are speaking of the fact that there is a continuity between the land and the body, and we shouldn't put in the land what we don't want to put in our body. And they speak also about the fact that the land or the territory in which we live are not just material physical things, but they have history. In the land at every turn reminds us of the people who struggled there, the people who have been buried there, the blood that was spilled to prevent injustice. And so they are very interested, for example, in recreating a certain collective memory, with the idea that this is important for building the commons, for building a common interest, to place our struggle in something bigger than us. So I think, and also there's a lot of work that women are doing in creating more collective forms of housework, because we know that what a price women have paid, and men too, for the isolating way in which housework has been organized, the family, the home, this division, these walls, this has been a political decision by capitalism, that united worker concentrated them in the factory and disaggregated them, in the community. So the place of reproduction has been a place of division, very, very planned, by the way urban planning has been organized. Like the Levittown model of community that was launched in the United States in the 40s and 50s is, typical of that. And so now there is an interest. Actually, it's not a new interest. It's an interest that many feminists have had since the 19th century. For example, women in the Fourierist movement, in many utopian socialist movements, they were very interested about how changing the family, changing the home, the collective kitchen, connecting the home to the neighborhood. Well, today, that impulse, it's there and it's growing. We need to find a different way of reproducing ourselves.